5:30 in the morning, November 1943. The temperature inside Building 22 holds steady at 92 degrees, regardless of the Michigan winter clawing at the windows outside. The Packard plant stretches across 40 acres of Detroit's east side, and from the air it looks less like a factory than a small city. A concrete fortress humming with the work of 40,000 men and women who haven't stopped producing in 3 years. The V12 Merlin engines rolling off these lines will power the P-51 Mustang screaming across the skies of Europe. And every 53 minutes, another one emerges, gleaming with oil and precision, ready for war. 80 trades practiced under one roof. Machinists who could measure tolerances invisible to the naked eye. Assembly workers whose hands moved with the rhythm of machinery they'd become extensions of. This was the place where American luxury was born, where presidents rode to their inaugurations, where the cars of kings and movie stars took shape, from raw steel and human sweat, and it became the largest abandoned factory in the world. Was this inevitable, the natural death of an industry that outlived its moment? Or was it something far more preventable, a series of decisions, miscalculations, and betrayals that murdered a company capable of winning a world war? The story begins not in Detroit, but in Warren, Ohio, on a November afternoon in 1899, when a mechanical engineer named James Ward Packard decided he had had enough of broken promises. He had purchased a Winton automobile, one of the finest horseless carriages money could buy, and found it riddled with problems. When he wrote to Alexander Winton with suggestions for improvement, the response came back cold and dismissive. "Build your own car if you think you can do better," Winton reportedly told him. So James Packard did exactly that. He enlisted his brother, William Dowd Packard, and their business partner, George Lewis Weiss, and together they set up shop at a factory on Dana Street Northeast. The first Packard automobile rolled out of that cramped Ohio facility on November 6, 1899, a modest machine with a single-cylinder engine producing barely enough power to climb a gentle hill. It cost more than twice what most automobiles sold for, and James Packard didn't care. From the very first day, he was building something different, not a horseless carriage for the masses, a machine for those who demanded perfection. The automobile incorporated innovations that competitors wouldn't adopt for years, a steering wheel rather than the tiller arrangement common in early cars, an enclosed engine compartment that protected mechanical components from road debris, suspension systems designed for actual road conditions rather than theoretical smoothness. Within 3 years, Packard had introduced the H-slot gear pattern that would become universal in manual transmissions, a layout so intuitive that drivers a century later would still use it without knowing who invented it. The company also pioneered the use of nickel steel in automotive construction, a material strong enough to withstand stresses that destroyed conventional components. The Packard brothers tested their vehicles exhaustively before releasing them to customers, rejecting shipments from suppliers with a ruthlessness that alienated vendors, but ensured that every vehicle bearing the Packard name could withstand whatever its owner subjected it to. By 1902, they had produced just 400 automobiles at the Warren plant, a tiny number compared to what Ford would soon achieve, but each one carried a reputation for reliability that spread through word of mouth among America's wealthy. Word traveled to Detroit. Henry Bourne Joy was a businessman from one of the city's oldest and wealthiest families. When he encountered a Packard in New York City and took it for a drive, he experienced something that would change the course of American industrial history. The car didn't break down. It didn't sputter or stall or leave him stranded on the side of the road. It simply worked beautifully and consistently, like a precision instrument rather than a mechanical experiment. Joy returned to Detroit and gathered his associates, Truman Handy Newberry, Russell A. Alger Jr., Philip McMillan, Dexter Ferry Jr., Joseph Boyer, Charles Ducharme, men whose names adorn the street signs of Detroit's finest neighborhoods. Together, they formed an investment group that would rescue Packard from its cramped Ohio origins and transform it into something far larger. On October 6, 1902, these Detroit investors refinanced and renamed the company as the Packard Motor Car Company. James Packard became president. Joy became general manager and would later rise to chairman of the board. But the real transformation came with a decision that would prove either brilliant or fatal, depending on how history chose to remember it. The company would move to Detroit. The reason seemed obvious at the time. Detroit was emerging as the center of American automobile production, with suppliers already established throughout the city, and Joy had the money and the connections to build something unprecedented. Not merely a factory, but the most advanced automobile manufacturing facility the world had ever seen. The relocation represented more than a change of address. It signaled a fundamental shift in Packard's ambitions. In Warren, the company had been a regional curiosity, a quality manufacturer serving a limited clientele within driving distance of northeastern Ohio. In Detroit, Packard would compete on the national stage against manufacturers with deeper pockets and broader distribution networks. Joy understood that survival in this arena required scale, and scale required infrastructure that Warren could never provide. The Detroit investors brought more than capital to the enterprise. They brought social connections that opened doors to customers who might never have encountered a Packard automobile otherwise. When Truman Newberry drove his Packard through the streets of Grosse Pointe, his neighbors took notice. When Russell Alger parked his vehicle outside the Detroit Club, fellow members inquired about the manufacturer. The automobile was becoming a status symbol among America's wealthy, and Packard's association with Detroit's elite positioned it perfectly to capture this emerging market. Joy also brought something less tangible, but equally valuable, a vision for what the automobile industry could become. He had studied manufacturing operations in Europe and understood that the craft-based production methods of early automakers would eventually give way to more systematic approaches. The question was whether that systematization would sacrifice quality for quantity, as Henry Ford would soon demonstrate was possible, or whether it could preserve the precision that distinguished fine automobiles from mere transportation. Joy believed Packard could achieve both, and he was willing to invest his fortune to prove it. To design it, Joy hired a young architect named Albert Kahn. Kahn was not yet the legendary figure he would become. Born in Germany in 1869, he had immigrated to Detroit with his family at age 12 and received no formal education beyond elementary school. Everything he knew about architecture came from apprenticeships and library books and a European scholarship that had exposed him to the grand buildings of the Old World. But Kahn possessed something that would prove more valuable than academic credentials: a mind that understood manufacturing. In March 1903, Kahn and his engineer brother Julius surveyed a 66-acre site along East Grand Boulevard on Detroit's east side. The land sat adjacent to a railway, essential for bringing in raw materials and shipping out finished automobiles. Kahn's initial designs called for a series of 1- and 2-story brick and timber buildings arranged in a hollow square, measuring 400 feet on each side. Construction proceeded at a pace that astonished contemporary observers. 90 days after breaking ground, the first building stood ready for occupancy. On October 10, 1903, Packard opened its new facility. The Detroit Free Press called it one of the most modern and best-arranged factory plants in the city. But Kahn wasn't satisfied. The timber and brick structures were functional, but they had limitations. Wood burned, brick crumbled. Support columns interrupted the vast open spaces that efficient assembly required. Workers toiled in dim interiors where natural light couldn't penetrate. Julius Kahn had been experimenting with a solution. Working from his brother's architectural projects, he had developed a revolutionary method of reinforcing concrete with steel, a Kahn truss bar that allowed for the construction of floors, walls, and columns that wouldn't fracture or fail under load. In 1906, Packard commissioned Albert Kahn to design Building 10, and with it, he changed the world. Building 10 was the first reinforced concrete automobile factory in the United States, and among the first in the world. Traditional concrete construction of the era used straight steel bars placed in the center of poured forms. When load was applied, the concrete between the bar and the surface often cracked, eventually leading to catastrophic failure. Julius Kahn's trussed bar solved this problem by extending diagonal members from the central bar toward the concrete surface, distributing stress throughout the material. Factory floors could now span distances of 50 feet or more without intermediate columns. Open spaces where assembly lines could flow uninterrupted, where machinery could be rearranged as production requirements changed. Fire risk, the constant terror of timber factories, essentially disappeared. Natural light streamed through windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and the building would stand, essentially, forever, requiring minimal maintenance compared to the structures it replaced. The effect on working conditions was immediate and dramatic. Workers who had labored in near darkness could now see their materials clearly. Ventilation improved as operable windows allowed air to flow through the enormous open spaces. The glass walls that became possible with reinforced concrete construction created working environments that would have seemed luxurious to laborers accustomed to traditional factories. Workers could look outside during their shifts, maintaining some connection to the natural world even as they tended machines in the service of industrial production. Word spread through industrial circles with the speed of revelation. Within a year, Kahn's firm had received commissions for reinforced concrete factories from Pierce Arrow, E.R. Thomas, Garford, and dozens of other manufacturers. The Packard plant had become a prototype for modern industry itself. By 1910, Packard occupied the largest automobile plant in the United States, 30 acres of continuous manufacturing space, employing over 6,000 workers. The factory had its own hospital, its own fire department, its own brass band, its own baseball team. There was pride in this work that transcended mere employment. Eventually, the complex would grow to 3.5 million square feet of floor space, with over 80 different trades practiced under one roof. Machinists, welders, tool and die makers, upholsterers, painters, electricians, carpenters, pattern makers, foundry workers, assemblers, inspectors, testers. Each trade had its own apprenticeship traditions, its own hierarchy of skill levels, its own pride in workmanship that distinguished master craftsmen from journeymen and journeymen from novices. A visitor walking through the plant in its prime would have experienced something closer to a small city than a single factory. The forge shop rang with the percussion of metal being shaped by enormous power, hammers. The foundry glowed with molten metal poured into molds. The machine shop hummed with lathes and milling machines operated by men who could hold tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The engine test cells produced a constant background roar as finished power plants underwent evaluation. Each engine ran for hours under instrumented conditions, its performance compared against specifications that left no room for variance. An engine that failed to meet standards was torn down, diagnosed, rebuilt, and tested again until it performed correctly or was scrapped entirely. The body shop displayed a different kind of craftsmanship. The fitting of panels, the alignment of doors, the installation of glass and hardware and upholstery. Quality control wasn't a department at Packard, it was a culture. Every worker understood that defects discovered later cost more to repair than defects caught immediately. Inspectors stationed throughout the production process examined work at every stage, rejecting anything that failed to meet standards and sending it back for rework. This obsession with quality produced automobiles that regularly outlasted their contemporaries by years or decades. And the automobiles that emerged from those concrete halls were unlike anything the world had seen. While Henry Ford was perfecting the assembly line for his Model T, a serviceable machine designed for the masses at the lowest possible price, Packard moved in precisely the opposite direction. The company's vehicles started at $2,600 in an era when most automobiles sold for between $375 and $1,500. A Packard cost more than a modest house in many American cities, and customers gladly paid it. The Twin Six, introduced in 1915, established Packard's reputation as the pinnacle of American luxury. Its 12 cylinders delivered 85 horsepower with a smoothness that made contemporary 4- and 6-cylinder engines feel like agricultural equipment by comparison. Each engine required roughly 600 hours of skilled labor from start to finish. Crankshafts were ground to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch, then polished to mirror finish. Connecting rods were balanced in sets of 12, any that varied by more than a few grams replaced. Contemporary automotive journalists struggled to find adequate comparisons. One wrote that, with the Twin Six operating at idle, you could balance a coin on its edge atop the engine block, and it would remain standing. The engineering philosophy behind the Twin Six reflected Packard's understanding of its customers. Wealthy buyers didn't need maximum horsepower or top speed. They needed refinement that announced their status without vulgar displays of mechanical aggression. The 12-cylinder configuration distributed power impulses so evenly that vibration essentially disappeared. Passengers could carry on conversations at highway speeds without raising their voices. Crystal stemware could travel in the passenger compartment without risk of shattering. The Twin Six also introduced innovations that would eventually become industry standards. Its aluminum pistons reduced reciprocating mass, allowing higher engine speeds without the durability problems that plagued heavier cast iron designs. The engine's forced feed lubrication system ensured that oil reached every bearing surface under pressure, eliminating the wear patterns that caused lesser engines to develop rattles and knocks after a few thousand miles. The ignition system used a distributor design that Packard had patented, providing more reliable spark timing than the magneto systems common on other vehicles. Production of the Twin Six required Packard to develop entirely new manufacturing capabilities. The company established its own aluminum foundry when outside suppliers couldn't meet quality specifications. It built specialized machines for grinding crankshafts to tolerances that no existing equipment could achieve. The investment was enormous, millions of dollars in an era when that sum represented real money. But Packard's management believed that manufacturing excellence would create competitive advantages impossible for lesser companies to replicate. The gamble paid off spectacularly. The Twin Six found its way into the garages of Hollywood's emerging royalty. Mary Pickford owned one, so did Charlie Chaplin. The imperial family of Japan maintained 10 Packards. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia ordered a custom Twin Six before the revolution ended his need for luxury automobiles. In March 1921, a Packard became the first automobile to transport a United States president to his inauguration, when Warren G. Harding rode down Pennsylvania Avenue. Horses and carriages had served every president before him. After Packard, they never would again. The company's advertising slogan emerged almost by accident. When James Packard's secretary asked what to tell a potential customer inquiring about the vehicles, Packard replied with characteristic confidence, "Just tell him to ask the man who owns one." The phrase stuck. For 55 years, it adorned Packard advertisements. And for most of that time, it remained true. Presidents owned Packards. Franklin Roosevelt rode in a Packard 12 during his governorship of New York. Calvin Coolidge chose Packard for official White House transportation. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, ironically perhaps given his communist ideology, received a Packard 12 as a diplomatic gift from Roosevelt in 1935. He already owned a Twin Six. By 1929, Packard had established itself as the American equivalent of Rolls-Royce, a name that signified not merely transportation, but arrival at the highest levels of society. The company produced roughly 50,000 vehicles annually, each one profitable at prices that competitors couldn't match. The future seemed assured. And then the world collapsed. The stock market crash of October 1929 devastated the luxury automobile market with a thoroughness that few industries experienced. In 1929, before the crash, Packard had sold roughly 50,000 vehicles. By 1932, annual sales had fallen to around 9,000. The company that had seemed invincible found itself fighting for survival alongside lesser manufacturers. The Depression's impact on Packard extended beyond declining sales figures. The network of independent coach builders who had created bespoke bodies for Packard's wealthiest customers collapsed almost entirely. Firms like Dietrich, LeBaron, and Brun, craftsmen who had transformed Packard chassis into rolling works of art, found themselves without orders. Custom body production required wealthy customers willing to wait months for delivery while paying prices that exceeded the cost of the chassis itself. Such customers had largely ceased to exist. The dealer network suffered accordingly. Packard dealerships had been temples of automotive luxury, elegant showrooms in prime, urban locations, staffed by salesmen who understood that their customers expected deference rather than pressure. These establishments operated on margins that assumed a steady flow of high-profit sales. When that flow diminished to a trickle, dealers faced impossible choices between maintaining the standards that Packard demanded and staying solvent. The company's response would shape everything that followed, a fateful decision that seemed brilliant at the time and catastrophic in retrospect. Rather than retreat, the company expanded upward. The Packard 12, introduced in 1932, replaced the Twin Six with even greater luxury and a starting price of $3,650. the equivalent of roughly $84,000 today. The automobile stretched over 20 feet in length, adorned with the iconic Packard Pelican hood ornament and vertical grille bars. Fewer than 5,500 were produced during its 7-year run, but exclusivity couldn't sustain a company through the Depression. The 12 represented Packard's defiant statement that quality and prestige could survive economic catastrophe. Its 445 cubic inch V12 engine produced 160 horsepower, more than enough to propel the massive vehicle with authority despite its considerable weight. The chassis incorporated the latest suspension technology, including ride control systems that allowed drivers to adjust shock absorber firmness while underway. Every example received individual attention from craftsmen who refused to compromise their standards regardless of the circumstances. Yet the market for such vehicles had shrunk to near invisibility. In 1933, Packard sold fewer than 1,000 12s. The customers who could afford such automobiles were precisely those most affected by the financial collapse. Their paper fortunes evaporated, their real estate holdings underwater, their confidence in economic recovery shattered. Even customers who retained their wealth often hesitated to display it ostentatiously when breadlines stretched around city blocks. Pierce Arrow, one of the 3 Ps alongside Packard and Peerless, ceased production in 1938. Peerless had already given up in 1932, converting its factory to brewery production. Of the great American luxury marques that had defined automotive excellence in the 1920s, only Packard remained. The company survived by compromising its principles. The Packard 120, introduced in 1935, carried a base price roughly $1,000 less than the company's traditional offerings. It featured independent front suspension and the quality construction that Packard owners expected, but at a price point accessible to upper-middle-class buyers rather than exclusively the wealthy. The 120 sold well. Perhaps too well. The problem was subtle but corrosive. When a Packard cost 3 or 4 times what a Chevrolet cost, ownership conferred undeniable status. When a Packard cost only slightly more than a Buick, the distinction blurred. The 120 looked similar to the Packard, 12 from a distance. Suddenly anyone could own a Packard, and that meant everyone who owned a Packard seemed slightly less special. The dilution of brand prestige proceeded slowly through the late 1930s, temporarily arrested by events far beyond the company's control. In 1939, war erupted in Europe. By 1941, America had joined the conflict, and Packard discovered a new purpose that would simultaneously save the company and accelerate its eventual destruction. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was widely considered the finest aircraft engine in the world, a supercharged V12 that powered the Supermarine Spitfires, defending Britain against the Luftwaffe. But Rolls-Royce couldn't produce enough of them. The war demanded more engines than British industry could supply. In 1940, negotiations began between the British government and American manufacturers. The obvious candidate was Ford, but Henry Ford's well-documented anti-Semitism and sympathies toward Nazi Germany made him unacceptable to many British officials. The contract went instead to Packard. The choice seemed unusual at first. Packard was a luxury car company, not an aerospace manufacturer, but the reasoning had a certain logic. Packard had been producing V12 engines since 1915, longer than almost any American manufacturer. The company's workforce included skilled craftsmen capable of the precision work that aircraft engines demanded. A $130 million contract was signed in September 1940. The challenges were immense. The Merlin had been designed for hand assembly by British craftsmen working in small batches. Converting it for mass production required redesigning thousands of components while ensuring that performance and reliability remained unchanged. Every blueprint had to be redrawn. Every machining process had to be reconceived. British specifications required translation into the American standard parts and tolerances used in Detroit factories. The engineering challenges went far beyond simple measurement conversion. British manufacturing practice relied heavily on skilled workers who adjusted and fitted components during assembly, compensating for variations that American mass production methods couldn't tolerate. A British mechanic assembling a Merlin would hand-fit bearing surfaces, adjust clearances by feel, and correct minor manufacturing variations through craftsmanship. American production required interchangeable parts that would assemble correctly without adjustment, a fundamentally different approach that demanded tighter tolerances throughout the manufacturing process. Packard's engineers discovered that many British components were actually specified to tolerances looser than American practice required. This seemed counterintuitive. How could looser tolerances produce a superior engine? Until they understood that British assembly methods compensated for manufacturing variation in ways that mass production couldn't replicate. The solution was to tighten specifications across the board, producing components that would assemble correctly regardless of which individual parts happened to come together on the assembly line. The supercharger presented particular challenges. The Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger was essential to its high-altitude performance, the feature that would eventually make the P-51 Mustang dominant above 15,000 feet. This complex mechanism required precision machining of impellers, housings, and drive components to tolerances that pushed the limits of available equipment. Packard developed new manufacturing processes specifically for supercharger production, investing in machinery that would be useful for nothing else if the war ended. Material specifications also required adaptation. British aluminum alloys differed from American equivalents in subtle ways that affected machining characteristics and final properties. Steel specifications called for compositions that American mills didn't routinely produce. Packard worked with suppliers to develop equivalent materials that would perform identically in service, testing each substitute exhaustively before approving it for production. But when the first American-built Merlin emerged, something remarkable happened. The Packard Foy 1650, as the American Merlin was designated, proved not merely equal to the British original, but in some ways superior. American mass production techniques produced engines with more consistent tolerances, greater reliability under combat conditions. By the war's end, Packard had manufactured over 55,000 Merlin engines, more than a third of total worldwide production. Those engines powered the aircraft that won the war in Europe. The P-51 Mustang had entered service with an Allison engine that performed adequately at low altitudes, but lost power dramatically above 15,000 feet, precisely the altitude where combat against German fighters occurred. When engineers fitted the Mustang with a Packard Vivo 1650, featuring a two-stage supercharger, the aircraft transformed. Suddenly, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, matching or exceeding the performance of anything the Luftwaffe could field. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, a Mustang ace, later wrote that the Merlin had great gobs of power and was equally at home, high or low, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Packard also developed marine versions of the V-12 that powered PT boats throughout the Pacific Theater, including PT-109, the vessel commanded by future President John F. Kennedy. Employment at the Packard plant surged to accommodate wartime production. 40,000 workers labored in shifts that ran around the clock, 7 days a week. Building 22 alone produced Merlin engines at a rate of 1 every 53 minutes at peak production. Converting the Merlin from a hand-built British engine to a mass-produced American product required redesigning roughly 10,000 individual parts. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, comprising roughly a quarter of the Packard workforce by 1944, performing work that contributed directly to the war effort. The transformation extended beyond the factory floor. Packard established training programs that took workers with no manufacturing experience and transformed them into precision machinists within weeks. The company developed new inspection techniques that could detect flaws invisible to conventional methods, techniques that would later influence quality control practices throughout American industry. A single defective engine component could mean a pilot's death over enemy territory. The stakes concentrated attention in ways that peacetime manufacturing never had. The logistics of wartime production strained every system to its limits. Raw materials arrived by rail in quantities that would have overwhelmed peacetime operations. The forge shop operated continuously, its hammers never falling silent. The foundry poured metal around the clock. Security measures restricted access to areas where sensitive work occurred, and workers understood, without being told, that what they produced mattered in ways their peacetime work never had. When the war ended in August 1945, Packard emerged with its reputation enhanced, its finances stable, and its workforce trained in precision manufacturing that had helped win the most destructive conflict in human history. Assets totaled $33 million. The future seemed bright. It would not remain so for long. The post-war automobile market presented opportunities and perils in equal measure. Americans who had deferred purchases during the Depression and then survived years of wartime rationing wanted new cars with a desperation that bordered on obsession. For 3 years following VJ Day, manufacturers could sell essentially any vehicle they produced. Demand so vastly exceeded supply that quality and styling became almost irrelevant. Packard resumed civilian production, introducing updated versions of the pre-war designs. The company sold over 116,000 vehicles in 1949, numbers that suggested recovery and stability. But beneath the surface, problems were accumulating. The styling that emerged from Packard's design studios reflected a company unable to decide what it wanted to be. The 1948 models featured a bathtub shape, rounded and flowing in ways that some found sleek and others compared to a pregnant elephant. Test driver Tom McCahill, writing for Modern Mechanics, referred to the newly designed Packard as a goat and a dowager in a Queen Mary hat. The criticism stung because it contained truth. Packard's designers had produced something that felt neither traditional nor modern, neither luxurious nor practical. Meanwhile, Cadillac was redefining American automotive style. The 1948 Cadillacs featured aircraft-inspired design elements, tail fins that suggested jet propulsion, chrome details that gleamed with post-war optimism, proportions. That made everything else on the road look dowdy by comparison. When Cadillac introduced an overhead valve V8 engine in 1949, powerful, efficient, and thoroughly modern, Packard's straight-eight engines suddenly seemed like relics from an earlier era. The contrast between the two companies' design philosophies illustrated broader differences in corporate culture. Cadillac had embraced the idea that automobiles should reflect contemporary aesthetics, that design should evolve with the times rather than preserve traditional forms. Harley Earl, General Motors' legendary styling chief, understood that customers bought automobiles partly as expressions of identity. And identity in post-war America meant looking forward rather than backward. Packard's designers operated under different assumptions. The company's traditional customers valued restraint and permanence over novelty. A Packard was supposed to look distinguished in ways that transcended fashion, appropriate for any occasion, never embarrassingly dated, never ostentatiously trendy. This philosophy had served the company well when its customers were established families whose wealth spanned generations. It served poorly when the customer base expanded to include newly prosperous buyers who wanted their automobiles to announce their arrival in the upper class. General Motors also possessed resources that Packard couldn't match. Cadillac, say, could invest millions in developing new engines and new body styles, because those costs could be spread across the entire General Motors product line. An engine developed for Cadillac might eventually appear in Oldsmobiles and Buicks as well, reducing the effective cost per vehicle. A body stamping developed for one division could be adapted for others, amortizing tooling expenses across hundreds of thousands of units. Packard bore the full cost of every development alone. Each new engine, each new body style, each new technology required investment that could only be recovered from Packard sales. As those sales declined, the investment burden per vehicle increased, creating a vicious cycle that squeezed margins ever tighter. The company's leadership compounded these problems with decisions that appeared sound in isolation but proved disastrous in combination. Packard had historically manufactured its own bodies, maintaining control over quality. But body manufacturing required enormous capital investment, and in the 1940s, Packard had outsourced this work to Briggs Manufacturing Company. In 1952, Walter Briggs died. His heirs sold the company to Chrysler. Chrysler agreed to continue supplying bodies to Packard through 1954. After that, Packard would need to find another source, or return to manufacturing its own bodies, at a cost the company could barely afford. The board of directors recognized that changes were necessary. The average age of Packard's leadership had reached 67 by the early 1950s, men who had built the company decades earlier, but now seemed ill-equipped to navigate the post-war market. Worse, Packard lacked a pension plan for executives, which meant that aging leaders were reluctant to retire. Younger talent couldn't advance. The company calcified. In 1952, the board hired James Nance, a 52-year-old outsider who had run the Hot Point Appliance Company, to serve as president and remake Packard for the modern era. Nance arrived with energy and ambition and a plan to restore Packard to its position as America's premier luxury brand. He would fail spectacularly, but not for lack of effort. Nance understood the core problem immediately. Packard's identity had become muddled beyond recognition. The company sold lower-priced models that competed with Buick and Oldsmobile while simultaneously trying to maintain a luxury image that competed with Cadillac. Customers couldn't tell what Packard represented anymore. Nance's solution was radical simplification. Packard would cease manufacturing mid-priced automobiles entirely and return to its roots as a pure luxury brand. The lower-priced models would be spun off under a separate nameplate, the Clipper, freeing Packard to compete directly with Cadillac at the top of the market. The 1953 Caribbean convertible demonstrated what Packard could achieve when it committed to luxury. Priced to compete with the Cadillac Eldorado and Buick Skylark, the Caribbean featured distinctive styling, powerful performance, and the kind of exclusive production run, only 750 units, that created genuine scarcity. The automobile received critical acclaim and outsold its competition. But the Caribbean couldn't sustain the company alone. Lower-priced Clippers still comprised over 80% of Packard's sales, and the body supply crisis added urgency. When Briggs ended its contract in 1954, Packard had to move assembly to a leased plant on Connor Avenue in Detroit, a facility too small and inefficient for the precision in manufacturing that Packard's reputation demanded. Quality problems emerged immediately. Doors didn't fit properly. Panel gaps exceeded specifications. Nance concluded that Packard couldn't survive as an independent company. Merger was the only path forward. Several independent American automakers faced similar pressures: rising development costs, competition from the Big Three, insufficient scale. George Mason, the chairman of Nash Kelvinator, had spent years attempting to consolidate these independents into a combined company large enough to survive. Nash and Hudson merged in 1954 to form American Motors Corporation. The question became whether Packard and Studebaker would join them. Packard and Studebaker seemed complementary. Packard built expensive cars for wealthy buyers. Studebaker built affordable cars for ordinary families. Combined, they could offer vehicles at every price point while maintaining distinct brand identities. The merger proceeded in October 1954. Technically, Packard purchased Studebaker. James Nance became president of the combined Studebaker-Packard Corporation. The financial terms reflected Packard's stronger position despite its smaller size. The announcement generated optimistic headlines about a new American automotive giant. The merger documents ran to hundreds of pages, detailing asset valuations, liability assumptions, and integration plans that would supposedly transform two struggling companies into a viable competitor. Lawyers and accountants on both sides had spent months negotiating terms that balanced the interests of shareholders, creditors, employees, and dealers. The resulting agreement seemed comprehensive, a blueprint for survival that addressed every foreseeable challenge. What the documents couldn't capture was the cultural chasm between the two organizations. Packard's workforce had spent decades building automobiles for customers who expected perfection. Studebaker's workforce had spent decades building automobiles for customers who expected value. These different orientations had produced different approaches to manufacturing, different relationships between workers and management, different understandings of what quality meant and how much it mattered. Studebaker's South Bend facility operated under labor agreements negotiated during the company's more prosperous years. Union contracts guaranteed wage rates and work rules that had seemed reasonable when Studebaker sold 200,000 vehicles annually, but became unsustainable as volumes declined. The company had repeatedly chosen short-term labor peace over long-term competitiveness, granting concessions that accumulated into structural disadvantages no management decision could overcome. The physical plan in South Bend reflected decades of incremental expansion without systematic planning. Buildings constructed in different eras used different construction methods, different floor layouts, different utility systems. Materials traveled circuitous paths between operations, because the logical flow that modern manufacturing required had never been designed into the facility. Overhead costs per vehicle far exceeded what competitors with purpose-built plants could achieve. The optimism lasted approximately 6 weeks. What Nance discovered after the merger completed was catastrophic. Studebaker had misrepresented its financial condition. The South Bend Company's break-even point required annual sales of roughly 250,000 to 300,000 vehicles. In 1954, Studebaker had sold barely 82,000. The accounting that revealed itself told a story of systemic dysfunction. Studebaker's cost per vehicle exceeded competitors by margins that made profitability impossible at any realistic sales volume. The manufacturing facilities in South Bend were obsolete, requiring far more labor per vehicle than competitors' modern plants. One industry veteran would later describe the merger as two drunks helping each other across the road. Nance had believed Studebaker's financial position was weak but manageable. He discovered it was terminal. The cash that Packard had accumulated during the war years began hemorrhaging towards South Bend. Resources that should have funded Packard's luxury revival instead subsidized a failing mass-market manufacturer. The planned consolidation with American Motors collapsed when George Mason died suddenly in October 1954. His successor, George Romney, wanted no part of Studebaker-Packard's problems. Defense contracts offered temporary relief, but Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson, formerly the CEO of General Motors, directed contracts toward his former company rather than its struggling competitors. By 1955, Studebaker-Packard was losing money at a rate that threatened bankruptcy within months. Sales had fallen 53% for Packard, 55% for Studebaker. Dealers were abandoning both brands. Roughly 30% of Studebaker's dealer network had departed by 1956. The 1955 Packards represented a desperate attempt at revival. Designer Dick Teague produced vehicles that received genuine critical acclaim, completely updated bodies, innovative torsion-level suspension that automatically adjusted to maintain a smooth ride regardless of load. The automobiles were good. They couldn't overcome the quality problems that plagued production. The move to the undersized Connor Avenue facility had disrupted manufacturing processes honed over decades. The reputation for craftsmanship that had taken 50 years to build eroded visibly with each vehicle that left the factory. Sales for 1955 reached approximately 55,000 units, far below what the company needed to survive. By early 1956, Studebaker-Packard's position had become untenable. Cash reserves were exhausted. Credit was unavailable. The company that had built engines for the P-51 Mustang couldn't pay its bills. The United States government intervened, not to save Packard, but to preserve Studebaker's defense manufacturing capabilities. Curtiss-Wright, an aviation company with substantial military contracts, agreed to provide operating capital in exchange for management control. Roy Hurley, Curtiss-Wright's president, took effective command. His first major decision was to close the Packard plant. The announcement came with the cold efficiency of corporate restructuring. East Grand Boulevard operations would cease. Production would consolidate at South Bend. The workforce that had built Packard automobiles for over 50 years, that had manufactured Merlin engines that powered fighters over Berlin and Tokyo, would be dismissed. The financial logic was unassailable. The Detroit plant was too large for the reduced production volumes that Studebaker-Packard could support. But financial logic doesn't capture what was being lost. The skills that existed at the Grand Boulevard plant, accumulated over decades, transmitted from generation to generation of workers, couldn't be transferred by moving machinery. The culture of quality that had defined Packard manufacturing couldn't be relocated by corporate fiat. When the workforce dispersed, something irreplaceable dispersed with them. The 40,000 workers who had built Merlin engines and luxury automobiles dispersed into an economy that had less and less use for their skills. Some found work at other automotive facilities. Some retrained for different industries. Some never worked again, joining the ranks of displaced workers whose stories statistics capture but never fully explain. The workers who remained in Detroit often found that the skills which had commanded premium wages at Packard translated poorly to other employment. Precision machining required years to master. Those years represented investment that couldn't easily be converted to other purposes. September 16, 1956. The last vehicle bodies rolled off the assembly line at the Grand Boulevard facility. 3 miles of conveyor lines were dismantled. 5,000. Tools weighing up to 5 tons each were loaded onto trucks. Workers who had spent careers at the plant, following fathers and grandfathers who had worked there before them, received their final paychecks and walked out through gates that had welcomed them for decades. The closure played out over weeks rather than days. Different departments shut down, according to schedules that reflected the complex choreography of automotive manufacturing. Paint operations ceased first, since there would be no more bodies to paint. Assembly lines followed, then machining operations, then the foundry and forge shops that had provided components for over half a century. Each shutdown represented not merely the end of a production process, but the dissolution of work groups that had functioned as communities within the larger factory. Some workers transferred to other automotive plants, carrying skills that remained valuable in an industry that still employed hundreds of thousands in the Detroit area. Others found that the specialized knowledge they had accumulated at Packard translated poorly to different manufacturing environments. A machinist who had spent 20 years grinding crankshafts to Packard specifications might find that other employers valued different skills, organized work differently, expected different relationships between workers and supervisors. The union locale that had represented Packard workers faced its own dissolution. Membership dues that had funded staff salaries and strike funds disappeared when the members themselves dispersed. The grievance procedures and seniority systems that had structured workplace relationships became meaningless when no workplace remained. Some local officers found positions with other UAW locals. Others discovered that their organizing skills had limited applications outside the labor movement. The Packard name survived another 2 years, attached to vehicles that weren't really Packards at all. Production had moved to South Bend, where workers built cars using Studebaker bodies with Packard badges affixed. The 1957 and 1958 Packards were rebadged Studebakers with redesigned grills, cosmetic changes that fooled no one. Sales dropped to 4,757 units in 1957, fewer still in 1958. On July 16, 1958, the last automobile bearing the Packard name rolled off the South Bend assembly line. The Marquis that had transported presidents to their inaugurations ceased to exist. Studebaker lingered until 1966 before finally closing its last plant in Hamilton, Ontario. The merger that was supposed to save both companies had destroyed them instead. The Grand Boulevard plant fell into a kind of industrial limbo. The Motor City Industrial Complex, as portions of the facility were renamed, continued operations through the 1990s, hosting various businesses that found the cheap rents useful. The city of Detroit claimed most of the property in 1994 after former owners failed to pay back taxes, but municipal government had no interest in maintaining 40 acres of aging industrial buildings. By 1999, the last legitimate businesses had departed. What followed was a different kind of occupation entirely. The transition from industrial facility to abandoned ruin accumulated gradually. The first winter after the last tenants departed, water infiltrated through roof sections that nobody maintained. Vandals arrived almost immediately. Windows shattered. Graffiti spread across surfaces that had once displayed safety warnings and production schedules. Homeless encampments formed in the more sheltered sections. Drug activity followed homelessness into the void. The understaffed Detroit Police Department had more pressing concerns than patrolling abandoned factories. Before the final descent into decay, the Packard plant experienced an unexpected interlude. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the abandoned factory became one of the epicenters of Detroit's underground rave culture. Promoters staged massive electronic music events in the cavernous spaces. Thousands of young people dancing amid concrete columns and broken windows. The building's industrial past providing ironic backdrop for celebrations of synthetic sound. The spastic parties hosted by techno DJ Richie Houghton achieved legendary status in electronic music circles, transforming the ruins of American manufacturing into temples of a thoroughly post-industrial aesthetic. The raves eventually ended, driven out by liability concerns and police attention. What replaced them was darker. Scrappers descended on the plant, stripping anything of value: copper wiring, steel beams, aluminum fixtures, pipes, rails. The reinforced concrete that had made the building revolutionary in 1906 proved remarkably durable, but everything within it became prey. The economics of scrapping created perverse incentives. Copper commanded premium prices, so scrappers stripped electrical systems completely, leaving buildings without the possibility of future electrical service even if someone wanted to restore them. Steel brought less per pound but existed in greater quantity, so structural elements disappeared if they could be cut free and transported. The very thoroughness of the stripping ensured that whatever remained would be less valuable and harder to rehabilitate. The danger of this work was substantial. Scrappers navigated unstable floors, weakened by water damage and fire. They climbed to upper levels using stairs that might give way without warning. They cut through metal without knowing what lay behind it. Structural supports, live electrical lines, gas pipes that might still contain pressure. Deaths occurred, though exact numbers remain uncertain, because those who died often had no one to report them missing. Fires became regular occurrences, some deliberate, some accidental. Each fire consumed more of what remained and further weakened structures already compromised. Roof sections collapsed, admitting rain and snow that accelerated decay below. The stripped buildings became shelters for those with nowhere else to go, gathering places for those conducting business they didn't want witnessed, dumping grounds for those disposing of things they wanted forgotten. On Christmas Eve 2013, urban explorers discovered the frozen body of a young man who had been murdered. Visible trauma to his neck suggested strangulation. 21-year-old Marco Davis became one of the bodies in the ruins. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. In October 2013, the body of Wayne State University law student Tianne Brown was found shot to death near the plant. In 2019, a 21-year-old man fell to his death down an elevator shaft while playing hide-and-seek. Police reported regular calls involving robbery, assault, arson, and worse. The plant that had once employed 40,000 workers in legitimate industry now harbored activities that would have horrified the craftsmen who built Packard automobiles. Photographers and urban explorers continued visiting despite the dangers. The Packard plant became internationally famous as ruin porn, its decaying splendor documented in thousands of photographs that circulated online as emblems of Detroit's collapse. Eminem filmed portions of his beautiful music video among the ruins. Amazon's The Grand Tour filmed there in 2018. The photographs that circulated weren't merely exercises in aesthetic appreciation of decay. They documented something that mattered: the physical evidence of industrial transformation, the concrete reality of economic change that statistics could never fully capture. Various owners attempted to imagine new futures for the property, but the scale of investment required exceeded what anyone could mobilize. In December 2013, Peruvian developer Fernando Palazuelo purchased the property at a Wayne County tax auction for $405,000, roughly $10 per acre. The site came with millions of dollars in environmental liabilities, demolition costs, and regulatory obligations. The auction itself told a story of exhausted options. The original asking price had been $975,000, the amount owed in back taxes, but no bidder had emerged. A second auction reduced the starting bid to $21,000, generating interest that culminated in a top bid of over $6 million from a Texas physician who announced plans to transform the site into an economic engine. That deal collapsed when the winning bidder couldn't complete payment. The second highest bidder, a Chicago developer, also failed to close. Eventually, Palazuelo emerged as the purchaser, acquiring a property that others had declined at higher prices. His background in historic preservation projects in Spain and Peru suggested someone capable of appreciating the architectural significance of what Albert Kahn had built. Palazuelo announced ambitious plans: a $350 million redevelopment featuring residential space, retail, offices, and light industry. The vision was compelling. The execution was absent. Years passed without visible progress. The buildings continued deteriorating. On January 23, 2019, the pedestrian bridge over East Grand Boulevard collapsed. The structure had connected Building 28 to the main complex, originally part of the assembly line that transported car bodies between manufacturing stages. It had become iconic, photographed endlessly as the most visible symbol of the plant's decay. Scrappers had cut out some of its support beams. The collapse happened around 3 in the afternoon. No one was injured. This plant for Packard guys is like the pyramids to Egyptologists, a historian told reporters at the scene. This, for us, is close to being sacred ground. Sacred ground was becoming rubble. The legal conflict between Palazuelo and the city of Detroit escalated through 2020 and 2021. In March 2022, Wayne County Circuit Court Judge Brian Sullivan ordered the property demolished. On October 27, 2022, demolition began on Building 21 of the Northern Complex. A second round commenced in January 2023, but Palazuelo managed to pay overdue property taxes just before a final deadline, preserving his ownership claim to portions of the site. The city halted demolition while legal questions sorted themselves out. As of this documentary's production, portions of the Packard plant remain standing, neither preserved nor demolished, simply decaying in a kind of industrial purgatory. The full demolition is expected to cost between $15 and $25 million. Mayor Mike Duggan summarized the situation. The abandoned Packard plant has been the source of national embarrassment for the city of Detroit for many years. It's been a source of personal pain for people in this community. What killed Packard? The question has no simple answer. Brand dilution operated gradually over 2 decades. Each year that lower-priced Packards outsold higher-priced Packards, the brand's associations shifted from pinnacle of American luxury to solid upper-middle-class transportation. The styling problems compounded this with visible evidence of decline. When Cadillac introduced tail fins in 1948, they announced post-war optimism. Packard's bathtub styling announced uncertainty. The Studebaker merger transformed gradual decline into accelerating collapse. Resources that might have funded competitive new designs disappeared into South Bend's bottomless needs. The Big Three commanded resources that independent manufacturers couldn't match. They could spend millions on development, then spread costs across hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Packard's smaller production volumes meant higher costs per unit, creating a competitive disadvantage that widened every year. Perhaps the most honest assessment recognizes that Packard failed for all these reasons simultaneously and cumulatively, each weakness amplifying the others until the company couldn't survive any of them. No single factor explains the death. The accumulation of factors does. Detroit's east side never recovered from the plant's closure. The neighborhoods that once housed workers, streets where children walked to schools funded by Packard property taxes, where churches held services for congregations whose livelihoods depended on the factory. Those neighborhoods declined in lockstep with the industry that had sustained them. Population that had peaked around 1.8 million in 1950 fell below 640,000 by 2020. The geography of Detroit's decline mapped onto the geography of its industrial past with tragic precision. The municipal government struggled to maintain basic services across territory designed for 3 times the current population. Fire departments consolidated stations. Police precincts merged. Water mains designed for neighborhoods of thousands served areas with hundreds of residents. Detroit's 2013 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, represented the culmination of trends that had been building for decades. The city owed roughly $18 billion that it couldn't pay. Pension obligations to retired workers exceeded the resources available to honor them. The Packard plant fit perfectly into narratives of civic collapse that journalists constructed around Detroit's troubles. Here was visible evidence, 3.5 million square feet of visible evidence, that something had gone terribly wrong. The ruins became a convenient symbol for processes that were actually far more complex than any single factory could represent. Yet the story doesn't end in unrelieved tragedy. Detroit has demonstrated resilience that confounded predictions of its permanent decline. The downtown that seemed abandoned in the 1990s has experienced genuine revival. Whether any such transformation will occur at the Packard site remains uncertain. The scale is daunting, 3.5 million square feet, much of it badly deteriorated. The neighborhood surrounding the plant faces challenges that no building, restoration can solve by itself. Historic preservation advocates have fought to save portions of the complex. arguing that adaptive reuse could transform abandoned industrial space into something valuable for a post-industrial economy. Similar projects have succeeded elsewhere, former factories becoming loft apartments, art galleries, tech incubators, creative spaces that celebrate industrial heritage while serving contemporary needs. The environmental remediation alone, cleaning soil contaminated by decades of industrial activity, would cost tens of millions of dollars. Structural stabilization requires expertise in historic preservation techniques that aren't readily available. Building systems need complete replacement. Each building presents unique problems that demand individual solutions, but the concrete that Albert Kahn poured over Julius Kahn's reinforcement bars more than a century ago continues standing, however battered. The history contained within those walls, the luxury automobiles, the wartime production, the rise and fall of an American icon, hasn't disappeared simply because the company that created it no longer exists. The policy questions raised by Packard's failure remain unresolved. Should government intervene to preserve domestic manufacturing capacity? Should workers displaced by industrial change receive support beyond unemployment insurance? Should communities dependent on single industries diversify before restructuring occurs? The market's verdict was clear. Packard couldn't compete. Whether that verdict was just, whether alternative outcomes might have produced better results for workers and communities, these questions received little consideration at the time and remain largely unexamined today. We live in a moment when these questions have acquired renewed urgency. Competition from abroad, now from China as well as Japan and Germany, challenges domestic producers with cost advantages that seem insurmountable. Automation eliminates jobs that previous generations considered secure. Companies that once anchored communities make decisions based on global optimization rather than local loyalty. The pattern that Packard experienced, competitive pressure leading to cost-cutting, leading to quality degradation, leading to customer departure, leading to accelerated decline, repeats across industries and decades. Retail stores close as e-commerce captures their customers. Local newspapers shutter as digital platforms capture their advertising revenue. The arithmetic of disruption operates with the same brutal efficiency in the 21st century that it demonstrated in the 20th. The Packard plant stands as warning and witness, a physical monument to what happens when companies fail to adapt, when markets shift faster than institutions can respond. But it also stands as testament to what human ambition can accomplish when circumstances permit. The factory that Albert Kahn built represented the cutting edge of industrial technology. The automobiles that rolled through its gates carried American craftsmanship to customers who believed, correctly, for decades, that Packard represented the finest their money could buy. The Merlin engines helped win a war that determined the future of human civilization. These things happened here. The ruins that now attract photographers and documentarians once housed work that mattered enormously. The silence that fills these spaces replaced a roar of productive activity that employed tens of thousands of people and generated wealth that built communities and funded institutions that outlasted the company itself. The last Packard built in Detroit rolled off the assembly line on September 16, 1956. The last Packard built anywhere followed on July 16, 1958. The slogan that served the company for 55 years, "Ask the man who owns one," became meaningless when there were no longer any new ones to own. But you can still ask. Packard Owners Clubs maintain vehicles that are now 60, 70, 80 years old, preserving not just the automobiles but the memory of what they represented. Collectors pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for pristine examples. Museums display Packards alongside artifacts of American industrial achievement, recognizing that these machines matter as cultural objects as well as transportation. The Packard Automobile Classics Club continues to hold annual meets where owners drive vehicles their grandfathers might have purchased new, demonstrating that these automobiles were built to last in ways that modern disposable engineering cannot replicate. And if you visit Detroit, you can still see the plant where these automobiles were built, perhaps not for much longer. Demolition continues, and what remains will eventually fall to development or decay or deliberate destruction. But for now, the concrete shells that Albert Kahn designed stand as they have stood for over a century, demonstrating both the durability of good engineering and the impermanence of even the grandest industrial ambitions. 40,000 workers filled these buildings when America was building the world. Now, silence fills them instead. The Packard plant, built 1903, closed 1958, still standing. Barely. If this documentary moved you, consider leaving a comment below. What other abandoned American industrial sites should we explore? What other stories of rise and fall deserve to be told? And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more ruins to visit, more histories to uncover, more questions to ask about the America that built the world, and the America that remains when the building stops.